Picture this. You are a foreign ambassador in the year 1665, summoned to Madrid, the glittering capital of Spain, to meet the most powerful monarch in Europe. As you pass through the towering gates of the royal palace, servants in bright livery guide you along echoing corridors lined with tapestries, gilded columns, and portraits of kings past. Everything radiates majesty, the overwhelming wealth of an empire upon which the sun quite literally never sets. You steel yourself to encounter majesty in human form, the embodiment of Spain's dominance. But when the throne room doors swing open, what you find waiting is not majesty at all. It is a nightmare. The boy before you is not even 10 years old, yet already he looks uncanny, malformed, as if nature herself has sculpted him in mockery. His jaw hangs perpetually open, incapable of closing, like a broken door. His tongue swells forward, forcing garbled sounds and wet gurgles from his throat whenever he tries to speak. His eyes, too far apart, seem to float in a pale, swollen face. He does not sit proudly, but slumps, head lolling slightly as though too heavy for his thin neck. For a moment, you are struck by the dreadful impression that this is no child, but a spectre conjured from a fever dream. The Spaniards call him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. Whispers suggest dark sorcery has cursed him, that demons crawl inside his frail body. But no one dares to say this aloud in the palace halls. For in truth, his curse is not born of witches' spells or devil's hands. It is far more chilling. Charles II of Spain, heir to the mighty Habsburg dynasty, is the creation of his own family's relentless obsession with purity. This moment, your imagined meeting with Charles, was a reality countless ambassadors endured. Venetian envoys described him with horror, noting how his mouth hung open like a fish gasping for air. French courtiers compared his speech to the last cries of a drowning man. Each new diplomat arrived expecting to bend the knee to a figure of strength, only to leave haunted, carrying back to their homelands not tales of Spanish glory, but of a monarch so broken he seemed to embody the decline of the empire itself. And yet, no matter the revulsion, all were required to bow. For in that grotesque figure sat the last hope of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had once dominated half the known world. The paradox was inescapable. The most powerful throne in Europe was occupied by the weakest of bodies. This is the story of how a dynasty's greatest strength, its hunger to keep power within, became its fatal weakness. How the pursuit of pure blood twisted into a nightmare of genetic collapse, and how the boy, who could barely speak, barely eat, and barely rule, would drag Spain into one of the bloodiest wars in European history. But before we descend fully into the life of Charles II, the broken king, we must first step back and understand the dynasty that produced him. For to comprehend his tragedy, one must enter the warped, desperate mindset of the Habsburg family itself. For more than 2 centuries, the Habsburg dynasty had ruled an empire so vast that it defied imagination. From the icy peaks of Austria to the fertile plains of Italy, from the Netherlands to the silver-rich mountains of Peru, from the Caribbean islands to the far shores of the Philippines, the Habsburgs presided over a dominion where, quite literally, the sun never set. It was said that when the bells of Madrid rang for vespers, dawn was just breaking over Manila. This was not merely a kingdom. It was the world's first truly global empire. And yet, at the heart of this power was an obsession so dark it would corrode everything the family had built. The Habsburgs believed their blood was not just noble, but sacred, imbued with a divine right to rule. To dilute it with outsiders, even other noble families, was, in their eyes, a betrayal. Thus, they sought to keep the bloodline pure. But purity, in their definition, meant something perilous. Marriage after marriage within the same family. Uncles wed nieces, first cousins joined in solemn union. And when genealogical lines became too tangled to trace, they invented new connections, ensuring that crowns and lands never strayed from Habsburg hands. The result was a dynasty that became both immensely powerful and biologically fragile. To modern science, their practice is nothing short of genetic self-destruction. Charles II of Spain, their final heir, carried an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To put this in perspective, a child born of a brother and sister has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles was, by genetics alone, more inbred than the offspring of siblings, but his condition was not the result of a single shocking marriage. It was the culmination of 11 consecutive generations of cousin unions. 11! By the time Charles was born, in 1661, the Habsburg family tree had ceased to resemble a tree at all. It was a closed circle, a grotesque web where the same names repeated over and over, twisting into impossible knots. Consider this nightmare. While a normal human being has 16 different great-grandparents, Charles had only 6. Entire branches of genetic diversity had been chopped away, leaving the young king as a grotesque concentration of recessive traits. Anna of Austria, for example, was simultaneously his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother. His ancestor, Philip, too, was his grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather all at once. Geneticists today calculate that Charles II had less biological diversity than a child born to parents who were full siblings. The evidence of this wasn't hidden, it was etched into his very face, stamped into his bones, and woven into every fibre of his frail body. What makes the story more chilling is that the Habsburgs knew. They weren't ignorant of the risks. Court physicians and advisors had warned them repeatedly since the 1500s that marrying so closely carried dangers. Medical records describe a steady rise in infant deaths, stillbirths, and grotesque deformities among royal children. Chronic illness and infertility became common whispers in the palace halls, and yet instead of heeding these warnings, the Habsburgs doubled down. To them, the prospect of sharing power with another family, of allowing foreign blood to taint their line, was more horrifying than producing sickly, malformed children. The dynasty willingly gambled with nature itself, sacrificing the health of their heirs to maintain political supremacy. The famous Habsburg jaw, the protruding chin and thick lower lip, seen in royal portraits, was the most visible marker of this decline. What had once been a mild quirk in family likeness grew grotesque with each generation. By Charles II, it had reached its catastrophic peak, a jaw so malformed it made eating, speaking, and even breathing a torment. But the jaw was only the most visible symptom. Beneath the surface, centuries of genetic collapse were working silently, ensuring that when Charles was finally born, he would embody the fatal weakness of an entire dynasty. By the early 1600s, the cracks in the Habsburg dynasty were no longer hidden. They were carved into the faces of their children. The famous Habsburg jaw, once merely a family peculiarity, had become a grotesque caricature. The lower lip jutted forward, heavy and swollen, giving many of the princes and princesses a permanent slack-mouthed expression. Teeth grew crooked, chewing became difficult, and some struggled to close their mouths at all. But the jaw was only the beginning. Court records paint a chilling picture: children who failed to thrive, infants who lived only a few days, heirs who reached adulthood but were infertile or plagued with illness. Spanish physicians began to note a troubling pattern: stillbirths, high infant mortality, and unexplained deformities. Reports of royal toddlers unable to walk or speak at expected ages became so frequent they were almost expected. Behind closed doors, the warnings grew louder. Advisors and doctors brave enough to risk offense urged the dynasty to abandon their obsession with incestuous marriages. They knew what was happening. Each generation was stacking the odds higher, narrowing the family's genetic diversity, until the children were little more than fragile vessels of disease. And yet the response from the Habsburg rulers was chilling in its arrogance. They did not open the bloodline, they did not seek healthier unions. Instead, they doubled down, arranging even closer marriages, as if proximity to their own bloodline was a talisman that could defy nature itself. It was less a dynasty than a gamble, a high-stakes wager that political control was worth the slow destruction of their heirs. The secrecy surrounding this decline only deepened the tragedy. When Philip V of Spain, Charles II's father, realized that his own son was severely deformed, his first instinct was not to seek medical aid or acknowledge the problem. Instead, he ordered that portraits of the child be destroyed. Court painters were instructed to hide every flaw, smoothing deformities with brushstrokes and inventing normalcy where there was none. And palace servants were threatened with silence. The health of the royal children was not a matter for medicine or reform. It was a matter of state secrecy. This culture of concealment created a horrifying cycle. Every generation produced weaker, sicker heirs, yet no one dared to admit it. To speak openly of the dynasty's decline was treason. To suggest that their obsession with purity was killing them was heresy. And so the family plunged onward, generation after generation, watching their heirs deteriorate while clinging ever tighter to the very practice that was destroying them. By the time Charles II was conceived, the dynasty was already teetering on the brink of collapse. He was not the unlucky accident of a single bad match. He was the inevitable outcome of centuries of deliberate choices, the final chapter in a long genetic tragedy. And when he entered the world in 1661, even the midwives who delivered him knew instantly that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. On the cold morning of November 6, 1661, the bells of Madrid were prepared to ring in celebration. The birth of a male heir was supposed to be a moment of triumph for Spain, the continuation of the Habsburg line, the assurance of dynastic survival. But in the birthing chamber of the royal palace, joy never came. When Charles, Prince of Asturias, entered the world, the midwives fell into an uneasy silence. There was no cheering, no rush of servants running to spread the good news. Instead, the women exchanged terrified glances. The child in their hands was not the healthy, robust heir they had been promised. His head was grotesquely large compared to his frail, undersized body. His eyes sat unnaturally far apart, giving him an alien appearance. And most disturbing of all, his jaw hung slack, permanently open as though frozen mid-gasp. Some whispered that he had been stillborn. Others crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. For an instant the future of Spain seemed already cursed, but fear of the king was greater than fear of God. The midwives were threatened with death if they ever revealed what they had seen. The doctors were forced to sign declarations that the infant prince was perfectly healthy, a gift from heaven. Outside the chamber, palace officials began the machinery of royal propaganda. Bells did ring across Madrid, but they were a hollow echo of the truth. Inside, there was only dread. The newborn struggled to feed, his jaw deformity, making even nursing a torment. His frail cries were described as strange and muffled, more like the sounds of an animal than a human child. Some attendants believed the boy would not survive his first days, but against all odds, or perhaps by the cruelty of fate, Charles clung to life. From the very beginning, his existence was marked not by celebration, but by concealment. The Habsburgs could not allow the world to know the true state of their heir. Every flaw had to be hidden, every deformity denied. What should have been a joyous announcement became a carefully orchestrated performance designed to convince Europe that Spain's future was secure. Yet those who were present knew otherwise. They had looked into the face of the infant king and seen not the promise of strength, but the unmistakable shadow of weakness. Some whispered he was bewitched, others that God himself had cursed the dynasty for its sins. Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear. The child was born broken, and as the years passed, it became impossible to deny. From the moment he left the cradle, it was clear that Charles was not like other children. His earliest years were not marked by playful curiosity or laughter, but by silence, illness, and constant struggle. Where other infants would lift their heads within months, Charles's neck remained too weak to bear the weight of his oversized skull. He did not manage the simple act of holding his head upright until the age of 6. Walking, too, was a mountain he could not climb. Most children take their first steps before their 2nd birthday. Charles remained bound to his nursemaid's arms until he was 8 years old, when at last he stumbled forward on his own, a halting, awkward shuffle that looked more like the unsteady gait of an old man than the proud stride of a young prince. Speech was another torment. Words would not form on his lips. The boy who was destined to rule the greatest empire in Europe could not communicate intelligibly until he was 10 years old, and even then his speech was slurred and wet, barely comprehensible to those closest to him. Every milestone of childhood arrived years late, if at all, as if his body and mind were trapped in a fog they could never escape. Worse still was the pain that seemed to haunt him. Court physicians noted that Charles would often cry for hours, without cause, as though racked by some internal agony invisible to the eye. He could not sleep properly, for his jaw deformity caused his tongue to slip backward, blocking his airway. His nights were restless, filled with choking gasps that terrified his attendants, and those attendants, wet nurses, tutors, and servants, lived in fear of him. One after another refused to care for the boy. Some were caught making the sign of the cross before approaching his cradle. Others whispered prayers as they entered his chambers, as though they were standing not before a child, but a vessel of something unnatural. To them, he seemed less human than cursed. Palace records from these years reveal an atmosphere of dread. Servants would draw lots to decide who had to tend the prince. Guards swore they heard strange sounds at night, cries that were not quite human, half-groans, half-wails that echoed through the darkened corridors. Whispers spread in Madrid that the child was bewitched, a vessel of sorcery, a punishment visited on Spain for its sins. And yet the dynasty could not afford to let the world see weakness. Official proclamations described Charles as healthy and strong, the pride of Spain, while behind the palace walls his caretakers lived in quiet terror of the fragile, suffering boy who could neither eat nor speak like other children. Charles's childhood was not merely difficult, it was a living nightmare, endured not only by himself but by everyone who crossed his path. Each day seemed to confirm the grim suspicion that Spain's future rested on a body and mind too broken to survive. By the age of 5, Charles was still frail, small and misshapen, but he was no longer a secret confined to the inner chambers of the palace. Spain could not hide its heir forever. In a world where dynastic marriages sealed political alliances, other courts demanded to see the boy who would one day inherit the Spanish Empire. And so in 1666, the task fell to Juan Carreño de Miranda, the royal court painter, to immortalize young Charles in paint. Carreño was no stranger to flattering his subjects. Artists of the Spanish court had long practiced the art of smoothing flaws, softening wrinkles, and ennobling features. But when he was summoned to paint the prince, he faced a challenge unlike any he had ever encountered. The child before him was pale and sickly, with thin limbs that hung awkwardly at his sides. His jaw protruded grotesquely, his mouth hanging open in a slack expression he could not control. His gaze was unfocused, his eyes wandering slightly apart. Carreño is said to have stared at the boy in silence for several minutes before lifting his brush. The final portrait presented to the world was, of course, a compromise. Charles was dressed in fine silks, posed regally with the trappings of power, a miniature armor, a plumed hat, the insignia of nobility. His frailty was hidden beneath rich fabrics. And yet, even with every artistic trick at his disposal, Carreño could not disguise the truth entirely. The deformities were too pronounced. The jaw jutted forward unmistakably, the lips sagged. The boy's expression seemed vacant, almost haunting. When the portrait was unveiled to foreign ambassadors, whispers filled the court. Letters carried back to France and Austria noted with unease that Spain's heir looked weak, delicate, even disturbed. One ambassador wrote bluntly that the boy resembled a child touched by heaven or else by something darker. Inside Spain, the painting was treated with reverence. Outside, it confirmed a growing suspicion. The mighty Habsburg dynasty was rotting from within, and its future lay in the hands of a broken child. And yet, this was only the beginning. As Charles grew older, his appearance and his condition would become impossible to mask. No portrait, however carefully painted, could conceal the reality of a king who was crumbling from the inside out. As Charles stumbled into adolescence, it became painfully clear that the boy who was meant to inherit the most powerful empire in the world was scarcely capable of caring for himself. His body remained frail, underdeveloped, and grotesquely malformed. Despite his age, he still appeared childlike, with thin limbs and a swollen head that seemed too heavy for his shoulders. The infamous Habsburg jaw had grown even more pronounced, leaving him unable to chew solid food. Meals often had to be cut into tiny pieces or softened into mush, lest he choke. But physical deformity was only one piece of the torment. Charles's mind lagged years behind his peers. At 14, he behaved more like a child of 6, easily distracted, prone to tantrums, and incapable of serious study. Tutors reported, with despair, that he could not read or write beyond the simplest words. Foreign observers who visited Madrid left horrified accounts. Ambassadors described the prince as imbecilic, incapable of reason, and more like a creature than a man. This weakness, however, was not seen through the lens of science or medicine. To those in 17th century Spain, it was not genetics that explained Charles's condition, it was the supernatural. Whispers of witchcraft swirled through the corridors of the palace. Some claimed that enemies of Spain had bewitched the prince in his cradle. Others believed he was cursed by God himself for the dynasty's arrogances and incestuous unions. Charles himself came to believe these stories. He was raised in a climate of fear, surrounded by priests and exorcists who convinced him that his every illness, his every failure was the work of sorcery. From his earliest years, he was subjected to bizarre rituals meant to cure him, holy water sprinkled daily, relics pressed against his lips, and prayers whispered endlessly at his bedside. He grew into a youth haunted by the invisible. Instead of developing the mind of a ruler, Charles became obsessed with curses and demons. He avoided mirrors, convinced that his reflection was a tool of the devil. He refused to sleep without relics beside him. On some nights, attendants swore. They heard him crying out in the dark, begging unseen spirits to release him from their grip. And all the while, Spain waited. The empire desperately needed a strong heir, a king capable of commanding armies, of uniting a fractured Europe. Instead, it was being handed to a boy who seemed more like a ghost than a monarch. The world began to whisper. The throne of Spain was cursed. By the late 1670s, Spain was crumbling. Its empire stretched across oceans, yet within its heart the machinery of power was rusting away. The boy king, Charles II, had grown into a young man of nearly 20, but he bore none of the qualities expected of a monarch. His health was collapsing, his mind clouded, his body fragile and misshapen. And yet, in the official chronicles, in the words of priests and ministers, Charles was still described as vigorous, wise, and destined for greatness. It was a grand illusion, a kingdom in denial. Court physicians were forced to write glowing reports that contradicted reality. Servants who spoke too openly of the king's weakness were dismissed, or worse, silenced. Every portrait painted of Charles was carefully adjusted, his deformities softened, his frame made to appear more regal than it truly was. Behind the palace walls he remained almost a prisoner, hidden from the eyes of Europe, but the truth could not be hidden forever. Ambassadors who visited Madrid carried grim reports back to their courts. The king could barely walk, his speech was slurred, and he often drooled uncontrollably. He suffered from seizures, his nights plagued by nightmares and suffocation. Some wrote that he seemed more corpse than king. Despite this, the machinery of dynastic politics pressed forward. Spain's ministers knew their empire depended on producing an heir, and so Charles, barely capable of holding a conversation, was pushed toward marriage. Foreign courts hesitated, but alliances demanded sacrifices. In 1679, the young king was wed to Marie-Louise of Orleans, the radiant niece of Louis XIV of France. The contrast between husband and wife could not have been starker. She was vivacious, intelligent, and full of life. Charles was frail, sluggish, and terrified. On their wedding night, attendants waited anxiously, for the union carried the hopes of the entire Spanish Empire. But months turned into years, and still no child was born. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the king was impotent, others whispered that Marie-Louise had been cursed never to conceive. Charles himself believed the latter, convinced that witches had bound his body. He turned increasingly to priests and exorcists rather than physicians. Exorcisms were performed in the royal palace. Rituals to unblock his manhood were carried out in secrecy. None of it worked, and as Spain's enemies grew stronger, France expanding, England rising, the Dutch consolidating power, its king sank deeper into superstition and decline. The people began to murmur what could no longer be denied. Their monarch was unfit, their dynasty doomed. But the court clung desperately to the lie, terrified that admitting the truth would collapse the empire overnight. Spain had wagered its future on Charles II, and it was a bet they were already losing. The union of Charles II and Marie-Louise of Orleans was meant to be the salvation of Spain. If the frail young king could father a son, the dynasty might yet endure. But from the very first night, whispers began. Attendants reported that Charles emerged from the marriage bed pale, trembling, and confused. Weeks passed, then months, then years. still no sign of pregnancy. The Spanish court grew anxious and Europe grew watchful. The problem was painfully clear. Charles, weak, deformed, and plagued by illness, was incapable of consummating the marriage in any lasting way. His body betrayed him at every attempt. Physicians prescribed tonics, strange concoctions of herbs and animal parts. Priests offered prayers, blessings, and even holy relics to be worn in the bedchamber. Nothing worked. For Marie-Louise, the situation was nothing short of a nightmare. She was a young woman of beauty and spirit, yet she found herself chained to a husband who seemed more spectre than man. Her letters reveal a deep sadness she felt, like a prisoner in Madrid, suffocated by ritual, tradition, and the constant pressure to conceive. The more time passed, the more she became the target of suspicion. If Charles was not producing an heir, surely, so the court reasoned, it must be the Queen's fault. Whispers spread that she was bewitched, cursed by her enemies, or secretly refusing her duties. Priests subjected her to humiliating rituals. She was made to drink bizarre fertility potions, to touch relics of saints, to endure endless interrogations about her private life. Charles himself believed it. Convinced that witches had stolen his virility, he called upon exorcists. More than once, rituals of purification were performed in the palace, with priests chanting over the royal couple as though battling unseen demons. Still, the womb of the Queen remained empty. The pressure only deepened when Spain's enemies gloated. Foreign ambassadors mocked the king in their secret reports, writing that the most powerful empire in Europe was ruled by a man who could not be a man. For 9 long years, Marie-Louise endured the despair of a barren marriage. Then, in 1689, tragedy struck. At just 26 years old, she fell ill after a ride on horseback and died within days. Officially, her death was blamed on a sudden fever. But in Madrid, no one believed it. Many whispered she had been poisoned. Some accused her political rivals, others said witches had finally claimed her. But in truth, her life had been consumed by a kingdom's desperation, her body sacrificed on the altar of Spain's collapsing future. Charles was devastated. He wept uncontrollably, refusing food for days, his frail body wasting further. For the first time, those around him feared the king himself might not survive his grief. But Spain had no choice. Within months, pressure mounted again. Charles had to remarry, for the dynasty's survival depended on it. And so began the search for a new queen, one last attempt to save a dying empire. After the sudden death of Marie-Louise, Spain was left panicked. The empire could not survive without an heir, and Charles II remained its only hope. Within months, his ministers arranged another marriage, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family famed for its fertility. The choice was no accident. Maria Anna's mother had given birth to an astonishing 17 children. Surely, the court reasoned, such blood would break the curse that hung over Spain. Ambassadors even joked that if anyone could bear an heir to the king, it would be her. But when Maria Anna arrived in Madrid in 1690, the illusion quickly unraveled. She was met not with a strong monarch, but with a ghostly husband. Charles, now 29, looked decades older. His body was failing him. His skin was pale and waxy, his hair thin, his limbs weak. He shuffled rather than walked, his speech slurred, his face marked by the grotesque Habsburg jaw. Despite this, the new queen dutifully tried to fulfill her role. Yet months passed, then years, and still there was no pregnancy. The truth was, undeniable, Charles was incapable of fathering a child, and as with his first wife, suspicion and superstition filled the void. Maria Anna was accused of witchcraft, of deliberately sabotaging the marriage. The king himself believed it. He became obsessed with the idea that sorcery had unmanned him. Priests, exorcists, and mystics were summoned to the palace, each promising to lift the curse. In one infamous ritual, Charles was made to drink a potion brewed from human bone, meant to restore his virility. It only made him violently ill. Meanwhile, his health deteriorated at an alarming pace. By his mid-30s, Charles could barely eat without choking. He suffered constant seizures. His body wasted away so dramatically that courtiers described him as a skeleton wrapped in skin. He was plagued by hallucinations, convinced that demons prowled his chambers at night. And still, the question of succession loomed. With no heir, Spain faced disaster. Rival powers in Europe, the French Bourbons, the Austrian Habsburgs, waited like vultures to seize the empire's inheritance. By the late 1690s, the court of Madrid no longer resembled the palace of a mighty empire. It had become more like a hospital ward, its corridors echoing with prayers, exorcisms, and the footsteps of doctors who knew there was no cure. Charles II, the bewitched, was fading before their eyes, and with him, so too was the great Spanish Empire. By the dawn of the 18th century, the King of Spain was a living spectre. Charles II was only 38, but he looked more like a man of 70. His skin was ashen, his body wasted to bone, his hair falling in clumps. He could no longer chew, could scarcely speak, and his legs trembled under the weight of his own frame. Courtiers described him as more dead than alive. Every corner of the palace reeked of desperation. Physicians tried in vain to preserve him with endless tonics and bleeding rituals. Priests performed exorcisms so often that the royal chambers echoed with chants night and day. Charles himself begged for deliverance, convinced that devils had taken root inside him. In November of 1700, the inevitable came. Charles collapsed, racked with seizures and hallucinations. For days he drifted between consciousness and delirium, crying out that witches were dragging him to hell. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, the last Habsburg King of Spain finally died. He was only 39 years old, but it was not his death that cemented his legend. It was what followed. By royal order, Charles's body was opened. What the physicians claimed to find was so grotesque that it spread like wildfire across Europe. Reports declared that his corpse contained almost nothing of a normal man. His heart was said to be the size of a single peppercorn, his intestines black and shriveled, his body full of water. And worst of all, he was found to have no blood in his veins. Whether these details were exaggerated by rumor or faithfully recorded, they only fueled the legend of Charles, the Bewitched. To his people, it confirmed what they had always believed. Their king had been cursed from birth, a vessel of sorcery and divine punishment. But to historians, the truth was far simpler and far more tragic. Centuries of inbreeding had collapsed an empire from within. The once mighty Habsburg dynasty, rulers of half the known world, had produced a king so broken in body and mind that he became a living symbol of decline. With Charles's death, the Spanish throne passed into foreign hands, igniting the War of Spanish Succession and forever altering the balance of Europe. But for Spain itself, the story of Charles II remains a haunting reminder. An empire can command armies, conquer continents, and amass treasures beyond imagining, yet still be destroyed from within by its own blood. Charles the Stout, El Hechizado, the bewitched king, did not just die. He rotted alive, taking an empire with him. The story of Charles II is one of the most haunting in royal history. To his contemporaries, he was a king bewitched, cursed by sorcery, and punished by God. To modern eyes, he is the tragic endpoint of a dynasty that had ruled too long through the same bloodline. The Habsburgs had once been the masters of Europe. They commanded Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, vast territories in Italy, and an empire in the Americas so immense that the sun never set upon it. Yet all their power, all their gold, and all their armies could not save them from a single fatal flaw: the obsession with keeping power within the family. By the time Charles was born, generations of intermarriage had eroded the strength of their blood. The Habsburg jaw, once a quirk of royal portraits, had become a deformity so severe that it crippled their last king. His body was weak, his mind clouded, his life consumed by illness and paranoia. He was not merely a sick man, he was the embodiment of a dynasty in collapse, and yet, behind the grotesque details lies a human tragedy. Charles did not choose his fate. He did not ask to be king, nor to carry the burden of centuries of inbreeding. From his first breath, his life was dictated by forces beyond his control: politics, superstition, and a desperate empire that refused to see the truth. In the end, Charles left no heir. His death in 1700 not only ended the Spanish Habsburg line, but also set Europe ablaze in the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped the continent for a century to come. His broken body, so long mocked and pitied, became the turning point of empires. Today, Charles II stands as a warning written in flesh and bone, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, is invincible, that the mightiest of dynasties can fall not from an enemy's sword, but from within, by their own choices, their own blood, their own blindness. The bewitched king rotted in life, and with him the Spanish Habsburg Empire decayed. But his story endures, chilling and unforgettable, a shadow cast across history.